Hi, and welcome to the Transition Discoveries Learning Series. In this video, we'll cover how to use the What Works Data Hub to complete your team's data review, leading to the identification of priorities for community-driven action planning during stages 3 and 4 of implementing transition discoveries. This video will be a guided walkthrough. I'll take you through step by step for how to use the What Works Data Hub along with the facilitated data review guide that is integrated directly into it. Alright, let's begin. So right here we're looking at the landing page that your team will see when you're signing into the What Works Data Hub. Your team will receive an email containing your username and password. This email will go to your team champion, and your team can use these credentials to get in and view your data. For this example today, I'm going to be using a fake account and some example fake data. So let's just sign in to our test account here. We recommend that you save this password in your computer. That'll be sent to you, so you don't have to keep looking it up each time. And now we're looking at the What Works Data Hub. When you get into the What Works Data Hub, the first thing your team is going to want to do is to scroll down the page to where it says Facilitated Data Review. This has all of the directions, steps, and procedures that you'll need in order to make the most out of this data hub. In our example today, we're going to read some aspects of the facilitated data review and walk through an example as if we were doing our review as a team. So, I'm going to take a moment just to read the introduction and directions that are provided to you in the facilitated guide. As your team explores the data, the prompts in this facilitated review will guide you through identifying areas of practices, programs, and services that are strengths and those that are potential areas for growth. The latter may become priorities for community-driven action planning and implementation during stages 3 and 4 of transition discoveries. Completion of this facilitated data review is a required deliverable of stage 2 of implementing transition discoveries. Upon completing this guide, the form will email a report of your team's notes and responses. Please save the notes emailed to you by this guide and be prepared to discuss your findings with your coaches in the near future. Your team only needs to complete this facilitated review once. As you continue to revisit your data, the team does not need to continue to complete this guide. It will be helpful to keep your original notes on hand as you revisit the data over time. Okay, so that gives you some context about what we'll be using this guide for. Once your team has read through those directions, you'll need to put in your district name and the email address of your team champion. And by putting in this email address, as I just mentioned, once you're done completing your data review and writing down all of the interesting things your team found in your review, the form and the dashboard will automatically send everything that you wrote down to that email address. You'll get it in the email and also as a PDF automatically in real time. Okay. So the first thing your team is going to do in the facilitated data review is to look at community representation in the data. And this is where, as a team, you're going to identify and discuss how many youth, parents/legal guardians, and transition stakeholders are represented in your data. So to complete this part, you'll be using this first section of the data review. You'll notice here for a moment that each section of the data review is highlighted in green, and it corresponds with a section of the What Works dashboard here. So, and they follow in order. So community representation, and that's also the first section of the What Works Data Hub. And all of the sections after this in the facilitated data review match the remaining sections of the Data Hub. So right now we're going to just focus on community representation in the data, getting an understanding of who responded, who shared their experiences. So there's some guiding questions and examples to support your team through this process. During this first activity, you won't actually be writing anything down in the facilitated data review. This is just a really important first step as your team gets some context about who's behind the scores and data and the written responses that you're about to see in your What Works Data Hub. So just some of those examples and guided questions. Your team can talk about what are the total number of youth, total number of families, and total number of stakeholders. And what we can do is we're looking at this first chart up here where it says school representation, and where it says grand total, that shows us the total number of youth, families, and stakeholders that we've collected data from. And if we hover over, the dashboard will show you a short sentence that explains what you're looking at. So each of these colored blocks here represent one of the groups and the number of responses from that group. And we see roughly here our responses are about even across our three groups. And we hover over and it tells us that there are 32 parents/legal guardians, that there are 32 young people, and 36 transition stakeholders in this example data. Your team might also look at how many youth, families, and stakeholders shared from each school. So here, looking at the legend, we see that dark green is transition stakeholder, the light green is young people, and then that middle of the road green is parent/legal guardian. And we can see here that we have quite a bit of transition stakeholders. We have some young people and some family members across all of ours. You'll also want to talk about if there's equal representation of youth, families, and stakeholders across your schools. So does one school have primarily young people? Does another school primarily have family members or stakeholders? Or is it equal across all of your schools? Of course, it won't always be equal, but generally are the amount of responses for each of those groups pretty close across your schools if you've collected from multiple schools. And then for each of your schools, whether you have one or multiple, what are the professional roles that are represented? So whether you have one or multiple schools, what are the professional roles represented in your data here? And you can see under the professional roles represented, you have all of the different possible roles that may have been in the responses from stakeholders. An important thing to note is that all of the blocks in this graph here that are some shade of blue are for stakeholders who are working with but outside of schools. And all of those that are some shade of green are those for stakeholders working either in a district or inside of a school. So of course that's your educators, your administrators, paraprofessionals, right? Coordinators and transition specialists. And then all of those blue are your agency staff, employers, health professionals, post-secondary professionals, nonprofits, of course. And just like before, you can hover over at any time to see a short sentence that explains the data for you. So I just randomly hovered over here, and it tells me that this block that I've hovered over represents the 4 general education teachers from School 1 who shared their experiences. In your data, it wouldn't say school 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or so on. It would actually say the school name. This is just example data, so we don't have real school names here. As I had mentioned before, your team won't be writing down anything that you talk about for this first activity. But the one thing you'll need to do from this activity is to identify whether you have data from one school or 2 or more schools. The reason for this is once you identify whether you have data from one school or two or more schools and click either one of those within the facilitated data review, the facilitated data review will then give you prompts specific to the type of data that your team has. So you're only working through prompts and getting guidance that's directly related and relevant to the data that you have. It will customize itself for you to make your data review process fast and easy. So with that said, in my example here, I see that I do have two or more schools. And just to note, in your data, if you have data from one school and also graduated / no longer in high school, then you would consider that you have two or more schools. So if you have one school, select one school, and if you have two or more schools, including school number one and graduated or no longer in high school, you would have two or more schools. So that's just make sure that you have clicked the correct criteria there before you go forward, because you don't want to have the facilitated data review giving you prompts and guidance and opportunities and activities that don't relate to the data that you have. So in my example, as I mentioned, I do have two or more schools. So in the guide right here, I'll be clicking two or more schools, and then I'll click the down, the little arrow to the right here. And I did this as an example to show you. You'll notice it immediately brought me back up to the page, and it asked me to put my district name and a valid email address. So it is smart, and it will prevent you from going forward unless you do those two things. And that's really to make sure that all teams get their notes and no one misses out on documenting all of those rich things you find in your data review. Also keep in mind, too, that completing this facilitated data review is the required deliverable for stage 2 of implementing transition discoveries. So I'll just put my email address right here. And then I can scroll back down. And now it lets me move on. And from this point forward, the facilitated data review is going to give you activities and prompts and guidance that is only related to the type of data that you have. So it's customizing itself for you. Okay. So we've completed our community representation in the data. Now you'll notice we've got a new section here, and it says quality indicators. And if we look on our What Works Data Hub, we see the next section after community representation is called quality indicators. So once again, each section of the facilitated data review matches the sections within the What Works Data Hub, and they follow the same sequence. So I'm going to take a moment here just to read some information about what the quality indicators are and how they're scored. Your team will, of course, be able to read this information as you do your data review, and you'll likely be refreshing yourself on this information when you get there. So, as defined by the Transition Discoveries, also known as TD, Quality Indicator Framework, there are 9 domains of high-quality transition practices, programs, and services, and we call these domains quality indicators. Each domain contains specific transition practices called sub-indicators, and there are a total of 54 of them. Every young person and family member who completed the Transition Discoveries Quality Indicator Survey rated how often they experienced the 54 practices within the framework on a scale from 1 to 3. Stakeholders did this as well. Each individual sub-indicator ratings are added together for each of the 9 quality indicators of the framework. So we've got these 9 quality indicators. Across them, there are a total of 54 sub-indicators. And the sub-indicators within each of those 9 indicators are added together, resulting in each individual having a quality indicator score. The average of these quality indicator scores is what's provided to you in this section of the What Works Data Hub. And on the Transition Discoveries Quality Indicator Survey, family members and stakeholders also rated how effective practices, programs, and services are for each of the quality indicators. And at the same time, stakeholders rated the overall level of resources available to implement these quality indicators. So to recap, we have scores overall for each of the 9 quality indicators, and that's what we're going to be looking at here. This is our overall view of what's going on in your district. Remember that for this current example here, I selected that I have 2 or more schools. So all of the activities that I'm currently getting are provided to me as if I have 2 or more schools. It's customizing itself for this. So we're going to go through this example of 2 or more schools, and then after this, we'll go through an example of having 1 school. And we'll see what those prompts are and what that process is, because that process is different than the one we're currently looking at here. It's not any harder or easier, it's just different, and it's catered specifically to that type of data. Okay, so with that said, if you have data for 1 school, you can either continue watching and see how it's done for multiple schools, or you can move on to that later part in the video, and the timestamp will be provided to you where you're watching this video. Okay. Now that we've learned a little bit about what the quality indicators are and how they're scored, let's look at what this activity is. So the goal of this second activity is to identify which school scores for the quality indicators meet the criteria for strength in practice, potential medium priority, and potential high priority, as well as the overall trends in these levels across your schools. So let's just take a look for a moment or two at this graph here that's going to display all of this data, and most importantly, let's set it up so we're able to answer this question. Throughout your data review, when you get to these activities, you're going to be provided what the goal is of the activity. Then you'll be told how to set the graph up, or as we call the visualizer, to make your data review really easy to answer that goal. And then you'll have some prompts and questions to support your team in talking about the data that's displayed to you. So what I'm going to do here is scroll within the facilitated data review, and let's read those directions for how to set this graph up. I'm going to be using the word graph and visualizer. They mean the same thing. And you'll definitely want to get familiar with that language. So what we're looking at here is a graph. It's also a visualizer. It's displaying or visualizing your data for you. Okay, so let's set it up. The first thing we're going to do is select level of detail. And a level of detail is either your entire district view or just individual schools. So the first thing we need to do is set it to what's called the all data snapshot. And that shows data for all of the schools in your district you've collected data for. Remember that in this current walkthrough, we're talking about teams who have data for 2 or more schools. So I'm going to click all data snapshot. Depending on your internet connection, it may take a moment for everything to load and to change itself. It's dynamic and it's pulling from your data, of course, secured in real time, and then creating these visuals for you. So you see it's pretty quick there. So we have selected the level of detail for all data snapshot because we want to see all of our schools, right? Remember that our goal here is to identify which school scores meet the criteria levels that we've just talked about and the overall trends across schools. So we want to see how all of our schools are doing. So we have all of our schools now displayed here. The next thing we want to do is set our age filter to 14 to 21, and we've got that already set here. We've got to have our current year of data. That's already set. And once we've done these 3 things, we clicked all data snapshot, 14 to 21, and then the current year, our next step is to start answering some of these questions that will lead us to completing this first goal. Okay. So before we answer those questions, let's just review this graph or visualizer together. You'll see that there is this dark black line going across, and at the bottom we have the names of each of the 9 quality indicators in the Transition Discoveries framework. And the line is going across, and it's providing you information about the average quality indicator score for each of those quality indicators. So that's what that number is, the average score across your youth, families, and stakeholders, across all of the schools, right? So this is all of your school data. And then below each of those numbers, you see information about what level this score is. So is it a strengthened practice at a district level? Is it a potential medium priority for improvement or a potential high priority for improvement? So this information is automatically analyzed and provided for you underneath each district level score. And then you'll also notice that underneath 2 of those, we'll see text that says that it's the highest score and which is the lowest score. This can be really helpful if some of the scores are close together, so you can read that text and immediately see that which is the highest score and which is the lowest score. All of those yellow circles that get larger as we get away from the district average represent your schools, and you'll see that they're clustered together, right? Some of them are more spread out, some of them are clustered together, showing that school scores, their averages for these quality indicators are similar, and when they're spread out, they're less similar. And then when you see those circles change color in this example, that depicts a different criteria level. So if scores are a potential high priority, they're one color. If scores are a potential medium priority, they're another. And if they're a strengthened practice, they're another. In this case, it's green. So that gives us an idea of what we're seeing in this chart or visualizer here. And on the left-hand side, we see the potential scores, so the minimum and maximum scores that can be obtained for each of these quality indicators. As you can see, your scores can be any whole number or a number with decimals as well. They can take on any number between 1 and 3, including decimals. And above the visualizer, we also have several filter options. We've just used a few of those, and we'll wait to talk about the others for later activities in this facilitated data review. You'll also notice that under each of the filters, there's a description that tells you what that filter applies to, because there are different graphs or visualizers on the What Works Data Hub, and the filters will automatically tell you, if you click that filter, what are you actually applying it to? So you don't have to click in order to find out. It tells you ahead of time, so you know if you're using the filters that make sense for the types of questions your team is trying to answer, and in particular, what the goal and questions are in the facilitated data review. So now, let's go back to the facilitated data review and work through an example of answering these questions as if we have our multiple school data. Okay, so I'm with my team here, and we're now going to complete this second activity. Answer the following questions for each of the quality indicators shown. So a really important thing to mention is that there are 9 quality indicators, but there may be instances where you don't have data for all of the 9 quality indicators. And you might be thinking, well, how is that possible? So the reason for that is that when youth, families, and stakeholders are completing the Transition Discovery Survey, they have the option to click Not Applicable or Does Not Apply to Me. So this helps us prevent situations where young people, families, or stakeholders are answering questions that don't relate to their experiences. And if for some reason everyone who had responded didn't think that was applicable to them, that data would not show automatically inside of your graph here. So of course, very unlikely that would happen. But if you're looking at your graph and you only see 8 or 7 indicators, that is why. And this becomes more common when you start filtering down to see specific school data for specific ages. As your data gets smaller, that's when that tends to become more common. And in our video today, you'll see some examples of that. But that's not something we have to worry about. It's a very unlikely situation, but if you do see that, that's why that's occurring. Okay, so let's answer these questions and complete the second activity. My first question is, do the majority of schools fall within the same criteria for the indicators? And if yes, which schools? So I'm going to start with my first indicator shown here, and I'm going to look and see, are the majority of schools falling within the same criteria area? So we're not focused on their particular scores, right? Not getting down into all the numbers. We're just looking at what criteria levels are they meeting. So we see here that the majority of them are yellow, and that is a potential medium priority in this example. And if we come back up, so are they falling within the same criteria? Yes, but we also see that there is one that isn't within the potential medium priority. So our second question is, are there one or more schools that meet a criteria level that is different than the majority of schools? So the majority here are potential medium priorities in our example, and there is one that's an outlier here. This is an outlier from the overall average in the district for this quality indicator. So by and large, in this example data, transition planning is a potential medium priority for improvement in the district, but we've got this one outlier. And now we want to see what that outlier is. So in order to see more information about a particular data point, in this example, a school, in your all data snapshot, you simply hover your mouse pointer over one of those circles. And when you hover your mouse pointer over that circle, you'll see what school it is, its actual score, and its priority level. Of course, you already know the priority level by looking at the colors, but it tells you here as well in the pop-up. Think of this pop-up as your little data guru that's alongside you the entire way of your data review. So this is one of many examples you'll see of being able to hover over points within your graphs and your visualizer to see more information. And oftentimes, that'll directly answer one of the questions in your activities. It's designed to be that way. So we see here that our outlier is students who have graduated or who are no longer in high school. Of course, this is fake data, so it's not necessarily realistic. We're just seeing how this can play out here. So that's how, if we had an outlier, we could hover over and see what that outlying school is. We also have the option to change the filter to either be under 14 or over 21. And we can also take some notes on whether these different criteria and those overall trends change by age level. That last part is totally optional, and it's really dependent upon whether or not you have data from youth, families, and stakeholders regarding transition for students who are under 14 or those who have graduated and are over 21. So I've been talking through these 3 questions here, but your team would write down your notes from your discussion as you talk about these questions together and look at your data. So you'll be writing down the things that you found and talked about here related to those questions right in the box provided. And once you've completed that, you'll move on to activity number 3. So in activity number 3, now that you've looked in the previous activity across those schools and looked at some outliers and what the majority of schools are scoring for the quality indicators and getting some ideas about district level trends, we're going to take that a step further for district level trends, and we're going to specifically look at the district level scores in order to identify our strengths and either our medium or high potential priorities for improvement. And while we do that, we're going to be looking at which of those quality indicators have the highest scores and the lowest scores at a district level. So your visualizer at this point may already be set up for you in the way that you need it. But in the case that it's not, and maybe you've clicked on some different filters and moved some things around, you will select all data snapshot, which is what we have here, 14 to 21, which is already set, and your current year of data. And then we're simply going to look at the black line here that goes across all of the quality indicators that represents the average quality indicator scores for each quality indicator at a district level, right? So across all of the schools in your data. And we're going to identify here at a district level, where are all of these quality indicators falling in terms of our different levels? So are they strengths in practice? Are they potential medium priorities for improvement or potential high priorities? And when we look at our visualizer here, we can see that each of these scores has the words medium potential medium priority underneath it. And that tells us that all of our quality indicators at a district level are medium priorities for improvement. We also see automatically for us, we don't have to look at each of the score numbers, they're provided, but the graph will automatically tell us that employment in this example has the highest average quality indicator score, and family engagement in this example has the lowest quality indicator score, the lowest average score. So that makes it really quick and easy for us to answer that question. And same as before, as your team is reviewing, you'll write down some of your notes and discussion around this question here and the way this visualizer is set up, as you talk about what are those district level averages, and in particular, what are our quality indicators that are strengths, potential medium priorities, and high priorities, and what's our greatest strength, our highest score, right, and what's our greatest potential for growth, which is our lowest score. So you'll be writing that information in the box provided. So throughout the facilitated data review, there are opportunities to what are called optional deep dives. So these are opportunities that are not required, but your team is able to do if you'd like to, that dive deeper into your data. So the first of these, if you have multiple schools, is an individual school review. So we've been looking at those district level trends, right? And now we're going to be looking at, if you opt to do so, the school level review. So the goals of this optional activity are to learn more about the indicators that are strengths and practices and those that are potential priorities for specific schools represented in your data. And you'll learn about this as well as the stakeholder reported levels of resources available at each of those schools that are either a medium or high potential priority. So if a school is a medium or high potential priority, you'll also see information about the resource levels available for those quality indicators, and that gives you a better idea about potentially why those are potential medium or high priorities. So our process for this optional activity, the first thing we need to do is set the level of detail in this quality indicator visualizer from all data snapshot to what it says individual school. So we'll click on that drop down. So we have selected a school. The next thing we have to do is to select a school that is an outlier for a medium or high priority within the all data snapshot. And if there are no outliers, we can just choose a school from the majority. So what I mean by this is, in our previous example, if I toggle this back, we saw that there were some outliers here for transition planning and person-directed planning here. So we would start off by looking at our outliers, if they were a lower priority level than the rest. So maybe you had a bunch of strengths in practice, which are awesome, and I'm sure you definitely will have those. And you had maybe one outlier where one of these quality indicators was a medium priority or a high priority, potentially. So you would either look at that, or in this case, we see that the majority of our schools in this data are falling within the same criteria of potential medium priority. So if I filter back here and go back to our question, what it's saying simply is that if you have some outliers, filter to those outliers first. Take a look at what's going on with those schools first. If you don't have any outliers, just pick a school from the majority and then keep looking at additional schools afterwards. And that decision is really based upon what your team feels is important. This is your data review. You own this data review. So if you don't have any outliers in this case, you can pick a school that your team wants to look at first and then look at additional schools afterwards. So in my example here, I'm going to just say that, let's say that school number 9 is the school that my team wants to look at. We saw that we had some outliers, but they were strengths in practice, and we're interested in figuring out what we can work on, what we can make even better. So we picked a school from the majority. Remember that all of my schools were medium potential priorities here. And we picked school 9 because it was one of the lower ones there in our data. And we really want to get a better idea of what's going on at that school. So we can hover our mouse over each circle to review and discuss the average scores by each group for each of the quality indicators for this school. And as we hover over the circles, we'll also see information. As we mentioned before, stakeholders and family members gave ratings of how effective these quality indicators are at those schools. So we'll see that information as well. Remember our little data guru that follows us along the way. We can hover over these circles to see more information, and there we go. So when we hover over here, we've got our scores for school 9. And actually, before we hover over, let's just take a look at this data for a moment. We see here that for school 9, we got 14 to 21. So these are all of our scores for school 9 for 14 to 21 across those quality indicators. These are all the averages across all the groups for this school. And we see that we've got some of our quality indicators are potential high priorities, some are potential medium priorities, and we don't have any strengths here. And we also notice these two different shapes. So you'll notice in the graph legend here, which tells you how to interpret the colors and symbols on your visualizer, on your graph. When we have a triangle pointing up, that's representative of the highest score. So the highest average score across the 9 quality indicators. And when the triangle is pointing downward, that's the lowest score out of all of those quality indicators. And your circles are all of your other scores. So we can see here immediately that employment is our highest score, and post-secondary education is our lowest score in this example data for school 9. We also see that employment is a potential medium priority, which makes sense. It's the highest score. And post-secondary education is a potential high priority. And we can hover over them to see more information. We can see the ratings of effectiveness, and we can also see the average scores for that quality indicator according to each group. When I hover over, it tells me, once again, this is school 9. It tells me it's for employment. I can see the average quality indicator score. I can see the information about each group. And I can see ratings of effectiveness. One really important thing to note here is where you see that 2.21 and that 1.98 here, those are not the scores for the schools. Those are the scores for the district, right? So this is showing us the district, that black line here, and school 9 together. So I have to hover over to see the score for school 9. School 9 score is not automatically shown for me. So just make sure you're looking at the legend so you have that clear. That black line and the numbers corresponding to it are the district average, and the shapes that are on there that are overlaid represent the school you filtered to. And when you hover over them, then you get to see that school score. So in this example here, we see that school number 9 is really close to the district average for employment. We can see that for this example here, all of our responses are from transition stakeholders. So remember, you might not have responses for all groups for all schools. This is one example where we just have responses from transition stakeholders. And then we also have an example of where we have those scores, but we also have some ratings of effectiveness by both parents and transition stakeholders. And you may see situations in your data where you only see average scores for one or two groups, not all of the groups, but then you see ratings of effectiveness for parents and stakeholders. So in this example here, we have only average scores for stakeholders, but we have ratings of effectiveness for parents and stakeholders. And you might be saying, why is that? Well, your What Works Data Hub will only calculate your average scores if the individuals have answered all of the questions related to that quality indicator, because we don't want individuals who have only answered some that are directly related to them. Remember those sub-indicators? We don't want them included in the quality indicator scores, because if they answered about only, let's say, 5 out of the 13 quality sub-indicators that are in employment, if they only answered about 5 of those, then their score would be much lower. And it wouldn't be that they had a low score, it's that they just didn't have everything related to them. So the reason for all of this is that unless people are answering all of the questions, their scores won't be shown in this pop-up here. And that helps you to see scores that are not skewed or artificially inflated or made lower just because someone didn't answer all of the questions. You always want to see the valid data, and that's what this example is here. So as your team is completing this activity and looking at those deep dive for the school, if you've chosen to do this activity, of course it's optional, you'll also have the opportunity to look at the second graph below this first graph, this first visualizer. And that displays, as we mentioned before, the resource levels for implementing the quality indicator shown. So we have filtered to school 9, and this second visualizer or graph here will automatically update itself for school 9's data. So keep in mind, this is just fake data, right? So it's not really realistic. But we can see here that for employment, for example, the median rating for resource levels, so money, time, training, right, all of those things that go into supporting staff in implementing and scaling up and making sure you have high quality transition practices, programs, and services. That data is collected on the Transition Discovery Survey. Stakeholders give their ratings of that, and that's displayed here. We have our 4 criteria level. There is no resource level, there's limited resource level, partial, and then sufficient resources. And for employment, which we saw before, was one of our strengths here. Well, of course, it was a potential medium priority. Of the potential medium priorities, it was the strongest one, right? We saw that it had partial resources. And just like before, we can hover over to see more information. And it says that the median rating of resources at school 9 to implement employment was 3 out of 4 possible points, and we see that relates to partial resource levels. You'll notice that these circles here within the resource level visualizer will get larger as they get higher up in the scale, and they become darker as they get higher up in the scale. So that helps you to draw your attention when you see the largest circles. Even if you're not looking at the side where it says what the level are, you immediately know if it's larger and it's higher up, that it is a greater resource level, and if it's smaller and lighter and further down, that it is a lower resource level. So your team, if you're choosing to do this optional deep dive for the quality indicators, you'd be writing down the things we've just talked about in this discussion box. And you could also repeat that for any other schools you want to review. So as we mentioned before, if you have outliers, you might want to look at those first if you're doing this optional deep dive. And if not, you can pick some schools that are important to your team from the majority and continue to work through as many schools as your team would like to. And at this point, if your team has either completed the one required activity, which is activity 2, or has done activity 2 and the deep dive, you'll have wrapped up your complete review around the quality indicators. And the next part of the facilitated data review and the visualizer for how it's designed are to look now within those quality indicators. There are those sub-indicators, right? There are a total of 54 of them that are not equally distributed across all of the quality indicators. So some have more, some have less. And you're going to be looking at, so if these quality indicators are potential priorities, well, what are the individual practices, programs, and services that contribute to why they are a potential priority, or why they are a strength in practice as well? So for this part of the data review, we'll be using the next section of the quality indicators. So for this next part of our review, which is activity 4, we'll be using the next section of your What Works Data Hub. So I'm going to scroll my facilitated data review to where it says quality sub-indicators, and I'll be moving between this and the next section of the What Works Data Hub. Before we look at that section, let's just read what the goal is, and some of our directions, and then we'll set the visualizer up like we did before, and then we'll run through the process through an example. So our goal now is within the district level medium and or high priority quality indicators that we've just looked at, we're going to identify which sub-indicators are exemplar practices, strengths, medium, high, or very high potential priorities. So keep in mind that just because something's a potential priority doesn't mean there's not great things happening. You may see instances where something is an area for growth, but there's also some strengths in there as well. It can happen. But keeping in mind that you'll most likely be looking at some medium, high, or very high potential priorities within those medium or high priority quality indicators. So that's our goal here. We're going to do a deeper dive and figure out in particular why some of these quality indicators are medium or high potential priorities for improvement. And our directions here tell us, once again, how to set up the visualizer. So we're going to go down to the visualizer now, take a look at it, and we're going to set it up. So here's the visualizer that we'll be using on the What Works Data Hub to get a view of this deeper dive here. So we're going to want to have this visualizer set to all data snapshots so we can see the data from all of our schools, ages 14 to 21. And if we go back to our directions, we also see we're going to select the current year, and we're going to choose an indicator that was either a medium or high potential priority from our activity 3, right, where we looked up here at our district line, we're going to pick one of those potential medium or high priority at a district level and do a deeper dive now. So I'm going to come down to the visualizer. And before we get started and look through some of the questions that we'll talk through as a team, let's just once again talk about what's in this graph, how to interpret it, and how to use the filters for it. Okay, so this one obviously looks a lot different than the others, and here's how it works. Each of these rows here represents one of your schools, so we have 9 fictitious schools here, and we also have graduated / no longer in high school. So we've got all of those here. And each of the rows represents the criteria level that are met by that school for each of the sub-indicators within the quality indicator we've chosen. So just to repeat that again, remember that we have selected one of our medium or high potential priority quality indicators from the district level. And now we're going to be looking at our breakdown of schools and their scores for the sub-indicators that make up that indicator. So in our previous data, we saw that youth development was one of our medium potential priorities. And I've selected that here. We can also, once again, we have additional features here for filtering by school and by group, but we'll be using those in additional activities afterwards. Those aren't directly related. And as I was mentioning, once again, like the previous visualizers, the filters will tell you exactly what they're used for. So we can see here that each of the schools has a rating for each of its sub-indicators. And the sub-indicators are in these columns. So in youth development, there's self-awareness, disability awareness, independent living, and so on, all of these different sub-indicators. And just for an example for how to interpret this, we see School 1. Under self-awareness, that was a potential medium priority. You'll notice that we have all of these circles, but once in a while you might see a diamond. The diamonds represent a very high potential priority for improvement. So that's to draw your attention to those very high potential priorities. So for School 2, self-awareness. So practices that support a young person with a disability and building their self-awareness are a potential very high priority at that school. You can see across those trends there, across all of the schools for all of the sub-indicators within this indicator of youth development. And at the bottom, there's something called overall level. So this is at a district level, once again. What are the sub-indicators being ranked at? What criteria are the sub-indicators meeting? So of course we saw before in this data that basically everything at a district level is a potential medium priority. So it's not surprising here that we see it an overall across all of the schools, not just at an indicator level, but now for the sub-indicators within youth development, that they're all potential medium priorities. But as we just saw, there are some outliers for our schools, especially around self-awareness in this data. We have total agreement for self-management and significant role of an adult. But self-awareness in our data here, we have some outliers. So we've got a potential very high priority. We have one that's a strength in practice at School 3. And we have some exemplar practice at School 5 and School 9. So that's just a quick example of how to interpret this data in the chart there. So you're not looking at scores, you're looking at criteria level. Everything related to scores has already been analyzed for you because we're focused on decision making and understanding our overall trends. So with that said, now that we've looked at how to interpret and how to use this visualizer, let's just go take a moment to look at the questions that are involved for this sub-indicator review. So we see that once we've set up our visualizer to show the data across our schools as well as our district for one of our high or medium potential priority sub-indicator indicators from our activity 3, we then have some questions and prompts to talk through as a team. So as we just saw at the bottom of that visualizer, we would look at the overall level to get an idea at a district level, what are our sub-indicators? Are they exemplar, strengths, or are they medium, high, or very high potential priorities? We just looked at that. And we would also look at the results for each school to see if there are outliers. And we just saw that as well, that some of our schools had our self-awareness as exemplar, while others were a high priority for improvement. So there's going to be that variability, of course. And that's the benefit of not just looking at the district average, but also looking at your individual schools, of course. And you'll be able to complete this process here for activity 4 for all of your sub-indicators that are either medium or high potential priorities. You could do it for strengths as well if you'd like. That's not required, but it's always great to know what's going really well and to get an idea of that. Most importantly, because when you have a great idea of what's going well, you can capitalize on it when you're making a plan to improve some of those priority areas, right? So all of your team discussion related to activity 4 is going to go in that text box just like before. And once you've completed that by using the visualizer we just saw below, you will have completed your review for all of your quantitative, your numerical data. And the next and final part of your review, if you have data, as we've been talking about from multiple schools, is to look at what we call the story behind the numbers. So this is your final activity. And this is all about looking at summaries of the written responses by youth, families, and stakeholders about effective transition practices, programs, and services related to those 9 areas of the framework, those quality indicators, and also the practices, programs, and services that could be improved within your potential priority areas for improvement. And it's so incredibly important to contextualize all of the criteria and sub-indicators that we just saw by reviewing these descriptions. We can really get a deep look at, so if these things are strengths, well, what makes them a strength? What's happening? What are we doing? And if they're a medium or high priority, well, what are we doing in those? What does it look like now? So now let's take a look at the visualizer. And we'll also take a look at the goal for this and talk about the process. So if we scroll down past the facilitated review section to the final part of the What Works Data Hub, you see the story behind the numbers. Remember that everything in the facilitated review matches one of the headers within your What Works Data Hub to make it easy. There's a description about where this data came from. So what you're going to be looking at in the story behind the numbers are summaries of participant responses. So as I mentioned, young people, families, and stakeholders have written responses about effective practices and also practices, programs, and services that are not just effective, but those that could be improved. And what happens is that behind the scenes, your dashboard has uncovered similarities between the responses and sentences within them. So all of those responses have either one sentence or multiple sentences, and the dashboard, the What Works Data Hub, has identified which responses most accurately represent all of the responses that are discussing a specific topic. So your What Works Data Hub has what's called artificial intelligence, and in the back end, it identifies the topics people are talking about, so young people, families, and stakeholders. Once it identifies those topics, it says, so which people are talking about these topics, what sentences best represent all of the different topics people are talking about, and then it picks out the sentences that best represent what everyone is talking about. So for example, if participants have shared about what makes transition planning effective, Your What Works Data Hub is going to select sentences that best represent all of the different practices, programs, and services that participants shared about that contribute to why it's effective. And on the flip side, if transition planning has some potential for growth, it will pull out those explanations of what could contribute to making it grow, to making it even better than it already is. And you'll see those sentences displayed for you. So this data is static. There's no filtering here. You get to see those sentences that summarize all of your qualitative or written responses for young people, parents, legal guardians, or family members, and transition stakeholders for both effective practices and areas for improvement and additional support. So let's go back up to the facilitated data review, and we'll be looking at the process here. So first, the goal is for your team to take some time to read through and reflect on these summaries of responses and to talk about together as a team whether you see examples of effective practices, programs, and services that relate to the strengths and areas for growth you saw in your previous activities you've just completed. So if you have strengths and practice, are you seeing some written descriptions that explain those strengths in greater detail once they're in context? And how are youth, families, and stakeholders describing them? What are the different things they're saying? You'll also be looking at whether or not young people, families, and stakeholders are talking about factors that contribute to strengths and those that could be improved. So those quality indicators that are strengths and those that could be improved, whether they're medium or highest priorities for improvement. And finally, you'll be talking about as a team, what do the responses tell you about these priorities during your previous activities and what might be contributing to your areas for growth? So if I come down here, I'd be simply saying as a team, well, hey, we saw that youth development was one of our areas that we could potentially grow upon and innovate and build out. It was a medium potential priority for improvement. So we're looking at our areas for improvement and additional support and looking if young people and families and stakeholders talked about that. They likely did, right? And what are those effective practices related to youth development? Looking at both of those. So of course, the information for your written responses is totally dependent upon what young people, families, and stakeholders write about. So there may be many times when you don't have written responses about all of the quality indicators. They don't have to provide their written responses. It's optional on the survey. So what is in this section really depends on the topics and things that were important to the young people, families, and stakeholders and what they spoke about. So once your team has completed that conversation around the written responses, you'll finish this whole data review up by looking and reflecting on everything you've written so far in the facilitated review. So you'll be scrolling back and looking at all of your notes and things you've talked about. And finally, you'll be answering that based upon your team's conversation around the data, so you're looking back at what you've written and what you've talked about and continuing your conversation, which indicators and related sub-indicators might be addressed and therefore improved upon through community action planning and implementation, which is the next step of transition discovery. So what you're doing here is stage 2, identifying your priorities, and stage 3 and 4 is taking some action to those priorities. So now that you've done your review, your final thing as a team is to say, so this is what we've learned. What might we focus on as we move into this next part of implementing transition discoveries, where we get our priorities and we start making a plan to improve them, and we implement that plan together with the support of our community. So that's your final component here. And once you're done, you'll click that arrow and you'll see a message that says your team's data review notes have been sent to the email you provided, and you can reach out to transitionqi@gmail.com for any technical support related to your data review. So related to your dashboard, something's not working. Very unlikely, almost impossible that would happen, but if for any reason you have a technical question and you need support, you can reach out to the email provided to get that additional assistance. So what we just did was go through a complete example of how to use the What Works Data Hub in a situation where a team has data from multiple schools. If your team has data from multiple schools, at this point, you've learned everything you need to know from this video. If you have data from only one school for your team, then this next part of the video is for you. So all of the things we talked about previously still apply in terms of how to use the dashboard, the What Works Data Hub, right? And the facilitated guide. There were just a few things that are different in terms of the activities. So we're going to go through those now together. And remember that this is for those teams who have data from just one school. So as before, I'm going to go to my facilitated data review, and I'll have to put in my district name. And just like before, you'll be looking at community representation in the data. And some of these prompts are not directly related to your team in this example, right? So you have one school, so you wouldn't be looking across school for representation, but you're looking at your one school and looking at how many youth, families, and stakeholders completed for that one school and how many stakeholders are from that one school. And just talking about that together. And most importantly, you're identifying that you have data from one school. Just like before, the facilitated review is organized in the same sequence as the What Works Data Hub. So for this first activity, for quality indicators, you'll just be looking at your one school. And your goal is to identify which of your school scores for the quality indicators meet the criteria for strength in practice, potential medium priority, or potential high priority. So for those teams with data from one school, you'll change the level of detail. So under Select Level of Detail, you'll click Individual School. You'll set your age range to 14 to 21. And hide/show school district scores. You're going to hide those district scores. So the district scores are going to be duplicates of your school scores, but it'll just get in the way for us here, and we're going to just remove that to make our process easier. So we're going to hide those district scores. And you'll see that district line is removed. Keep in mind that the What Works Data Hub is designed for a ton of different data situations, and we'll be just toggling some of those things on and off to make it work for the type of data that we have. So if your team who has data for one school, you'll then be looking at the visualizer here and figuring out which of your quality indicators are strengths and which are either medium or high potential priorities. So we can see here that we've got youth development as a medium priority. We've got transition planning as a high priority. We see that the highest score is for employment and the lowest is for post-secondary education. And we know that because our triangle facing up is the highest score and our triangle pointing down is the lowest score. All of the circles are the other scores, the remaining scores. So we'll be looking at what criteria level each of our quality indicators are for this school. And we'll also be looking at the resource levels available. So for school 9 here, let's say our school is school 9, we're looking at the resource levels available for each of our quality indicators. So if it's a potential medium or high priority, well, what's the resource level available to us at our school right now that might contribute to why it is a medium or high potential priority? And on the flip side, if it's a strength, and we see some sufficient resources, that gives us an idea of what might contribute to why that is a strength in practice. So these are things you'll be writing down as a team. So a little bit different than the district level run. So you won't be using that all data snapshot at all if you have data from one school. You'll only be using the level of detail for individual school. So that's a little bit different for those teams. For your sub-indicators, rather than looking at our full view here, you'll be looking at an individual school view. So you'll change your level of detail, and you'll see the scores for just your school. So in all situations, you're going to be changing that level of detail from all data snapshot to individual school. And that'll give you that full information about your school for those teams who have data from one school. And when you're looking at your sub-indicators for that one school, you'll be doing a lot of the same things that were done for teams who have multiple schools. You'll be exploring strengths and areas for growth. So those quality indicators previously here that were strengths and our greatest areas for growth. So we might take a look at post-secondary education and explore what makes post-secondary education our area for growth here. So you could filter and look. And you can see that they're all medium priorities for improvement. So we've got pre-college programs, college-based transition programs, post-secondary ed, including VOC, and career training programs, right? So you'll be able to get that deeper dive. You have the option, it's not required, but you can look at results for just a particular role. So just look at what youth said, or families, or stakeholders, and their different age ranges as well for those who have data for one school. There we go. And same as before, you'll be putting down some of your discussion around the data in that box provided, and your story behind the numbers will be exactly the same whether you're looking at data from one school or multiple schools. And as before, once you've gone through and talked about your quality indicator scores, so those 9 domains, and then the specific strengths and areas of growth within those, which are called the sub-indicators, you'll wrap your data review up if you're a team looking at data for one school, just like the multi-district, multi-school district, by thinking back on your discussion and looking at your notes and identifying which indicators and sub-indicators might be addressed for community action planning and implementation during the upcoming stages of transition discovery. So rounding out this process the same whether you have data from one school or multiple schools. And that concludes this video for how to use your What Works Data Hub to gain some critical insights about what's going on in transition in terms of strengths and areas for growth in your school or your district. Just some final points about this data hub, accessing it and using it. So your data comes directly in. Once it's collected and it's put into your dashboard, it is completely secure on Transition Discovery's server. It is hosted there, and only your team will have access to it through those credentials that we'll be sending to you in an email. And that email will be going to your team champion. So your team champion will get the credentials to access your What Works Data Hub, and all this information will come to you in an email from the Transition Discovery's coaches and initiative. So stay tuned for that. And now that you've completed watching this video, the next step and final step of this module is to complete the prompts and activities below the video. So take some time to complete those short activities below this video, submit, and you'll have completed the deliverable training-wise for stage 2. Once you've completed this training, and your data is in, you'll be ready to start making meaning from that data and identifying priorities for action planning.